The rain came to Blackmore as it always did in autumn, not gently, not with the soft whisper of summer showers, but with a fury that seemed born of the moors themselves, as though the very sky sought to drown the ancient stones in their own bitter memories. It lashed against the grey walls of Blackmore Hall with the persistence of a living thing, streaking down windows that had not been properly cleaned in months, pooling in the cracked flagstones of the courtyard, where weeds had begun their slow conquest of what had once been immaculate grounds. The hall itself rose from the moorland like a creature of shadow and stone, its towers reaching toward clouds so heavy and dark they seemed to press down upon the earth with physical weight, and those who passed along the distant road, though few did any more, crossed themselves and hurried their horses onward, for the stories that swirled around that place had grown darker with each passing season. In the kitchens, where the fire burned low and the cook's hands trembled as she kneaded bread she knew would go largely uneaten, the servants spoke in voices barely above whispers, their words carrying the weight of accumulated dread. "He walks again," muttered Thomas, the aging footman who remembered brighter days, who remembered when laughter had echoed through these corridors and the young master had sketched flowers in the garden while his mother sang. "Heard him pacing half the night." "I did. Up and down the east corridor like a ghost himself." The housemaid Sarah clutched her rosary beneath her apron and said nothing, but her eyes darted toward the ceiling, as though the floorboards themselves might reveal the master's approach. They called him the Beast of Blackmore now, though never within earshot, never where his shadow might fall across their trembling forms. The Duke, Marcus Ashworth, who had ridden away to war 3 years past as the golden hope of his family and returned 2 years ago as something else entirely. The servants had watched him descend from his carriage that grey morning, had seen the scar that now carved its terrible path from his left temple to his jaw, had witnessed the emptiness in eyes that had once sparkled with warmth and wit, and they had known in that moment that whatever had survived the battlefield, it was not the man they had loved. He stalked the corridors now at all hours, a shadow among shadows, and when he spoke, which was rarely his voice, carried the grinding weight of stones in a tomb. His temper, once slow to kindle, had become a living flame that consumed everything in its path. 2 housemaids had fled in the past month alone, and even the steward, Mr. Hartley, who had served 3 generations of Ashworths, had begun to speak quietly of retirement. And so Blackmore Hall waited, wrapped in rain and rumour, while somewhere in its depths the Duke stood at his window watching the storm rage across his lands, seeing nothing but the faces of the dead, feeling nothing but the cold that had settled into his bones on a blood-soaked field, far from home, and had never, not for one moment since, released its grip upon his shattered soul. 300 miles to the south, in a cramped London boarding house where the wallpaper peeled and the windows let in draughts that no amount of stuffing with rags could prevent, Eleanor Whitmore sat at a writing desk that had once belonged to her mother and read the letter that would alter the course of her existence, her hands steady even as her heart performed a strange, tumbling rhythm against her ribs. The letter bore her uncle's seal, Uncle Bartholomew, her father's elder brother, who had not spoken to their family in 7 years, who had declared her father dead to him long before the gambling debts and the disgrace and the final, terrible night when Edward Whitmore had put a pistol to his temple rather than face the men who had come to collect what he owed. Eleanor had been the one to find him, had been the one to close his staring eyes and wash the blood from the study floor before the servants could see, and she had buried him with the last of the family silver, selling her mother's pearls to pay for a headstone that bore no mention of how he died. Now, 6 months later, with the boarding house demanding payment she could not provide and the last of her teaching positions lost when the school discovered the scandal attached to her name, she opened her uncle's letter and learned that debts, like ghosts, did not rest quietly in their graves. The sum her father owed had been purchased by a single creditor, consolidated into one terrible number that would follow her until she paid it or died, and her uncle, out of duty rather than affection, his letter made clear, had arranged a solution. She was to travel north, to a place called Blackmore Hall, where she would serve as companion to the Dowager Duchess, grandmother to the current Duke, and in exchange for 1 year of service, the debt would be forgiven. Her uncle did not mention the rumours about the Duke, did not speak of the whispered tales that had reached even London drawing-rooms, but Eleanor had heard them nonetheless, stories of a man driven mad by war, of servants who fled in the night, of a house that had become a tomb for the living. She read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside her mother's locket, the only treasure she had left, the one piece of her former life that the creditors had not claimed. She thought of the alternatives, the workhouse, the streets, the slow death of pride that came from accepting charity from those who had once called themselves friends, and she thought of her mother, who had taught her that dignity was not something that could be taken, only surrendered. The next morning, Eleanor Whitmore boarded a modest carriage bound for the northern moors, carrying a single trunk of worn but well-mended clothes, her mother's locket pressed against her heart, and the quiet, unshakable conviction that whatever waited for her at Blackmore Hall, she would meet it standing upright, with her eyes open and her spirit unbowed. She had barely been at Blackmore Hall an hour, barely had time to shed her rain-soaked travelling cloak and accept the cup of tepid tea that the nervous housemaid pressed into her trembling hands when the summons came, delivered by a footman whose face had gone the colour of old parchment, his voice scarcely above a whisper, as he informed her that His Grace required her presence in his study immediately, and that she should not keep him waiting. Eleanor set down her tea with steady hands, though her heart had begun to beat a rhythm that seemed too large for her chest, and she followed the footman through corridors that seemed designed to swallow light, past portraits of Ashworth's long dead, whose painted eyes seemed to track her passage with something between warning and pity, until at last they reached a door of heavy oak that the footman opened with visible reluctance, before retreating so quickly his footsteps echoed like flight. The study was a room that had forgotten what sunlight looked like, its windows shrouded in curtains the colour of dried blood, its walls lined with books that appeared to have gone unread for years, and at its centre, behind a desk cluttered with papers he clearly was not reading, sat the Duke of Blackmore, and Eleanor understood, in that first terrible moment of seeing him, why the servants crossed themselves when they spoke his name. The scar was worse than the rumours had suggested, a twisted path of ruined flesh that carved through what must once have been a handsome face. But it was not the scar that made her breath catch in her throat, it was his eyes, dark as the moors at midnight, empty as tombs, holding within their depths a pain so vast and so carefully contained that she felt she was looking at a man who had already died and simply had not yet stopped moving. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was exactly as the servants had described it, grinding stone, the sound of something heavy being dragged across a crypt floor, and he did not rise, did not offer her a seat, did not extend any of the courtesies that his rank and her genteel birth should have commanded. "You will obey me in all things while you remain under this roof. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not question my commands, and you will remember that you are here not as a guest, but as a debtor, working to clear a debt that, frankly, your wretched father should never have accumulated." Eleanor felt the words land like blows, felt the intended humiliation in every syllable, and some part of her, the part that had learned to bow, to scrape, to accept the cruelties of circumstance, urged her to lower her eyes, to murmur acquiescence, to become small and safe and invisible, as this man clearly expected her to become. But there was another part of her, forged in the fire of her father's death and the ashes of everything she had lost, and it was this part that lifted her chin and met those empty, terrible eyes without flinching. "I am here to serve as companion to your grandmother, your Grace," she said, and her voice did not tremble, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her worn skirt, had begun to shake. "That duty I will fulfill with diligence and care, for I am told she is a woman deserving of both, but I am not a hound to be commanded, and my obedience extends only to what is reasonable, honourable, and within the bounds of the arrangement my uncle has brokered." For a long moment the Duke simply stared at her, and Eleanor watched something flicker in those dead eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of some emotion he had long since learned to bury, and when he spoke again, his voice had not softened, but something in its grinding quality had shifted, as though a stone had been moved a fraction of an inch from its accustomed place. "You may go," he said, and turned away from her, dismissing her as one might dismiss a servant. But Eleanor, as she walked from that dark room with her dignity wrapped around her like armour, knew that something had passed between them in that moment, something neither of them yet had words to name. The Dowager Duchess occupied a suite of rooms in the East Wing, where the morning light, on those rare occasions when the clouds parted enough to permit, it fell through tall windows onto faded carpets that had once been the colour of summer roses, and it was here that Eleanor was brought on her second day at Blackmore Hall, her nerves still raw from her encounter with the Duke, her mind still turning over the strange flicker she had witnessed in his hollow eyes, and what she found waiting for her in that sun-starved chamber was not the frail, pitiable creature she had expected, but a woman whose body had betrayed her, while her spirit remained as sharp and unyielding as a blade kept too long in its sheath. Lady Ashworth sat propped against a mountain of pillows in a chair by the window, her white hair arranged with care that spoke of vanity not yet surrendered, her eyes the same dark shade as her grandson's, but alive, burning with intelligence and something that might have been mischief fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and peer directly into the marrow of the soul. "So you are the lamb my grandson has brought to his slaughterhouse," the dowager said, and her voice, though thin with age, carried the unmistakable authority of a woman who had spent decades commanding households and shaping the fates of lesser beings. "Come closer, child. Let me see what manner of creature dares to look Marcus Ashworth in the eye and speak of honor." Eleanor approached, and something in the old woman's gaze softened not into pity, which Eleanor could not have borne, but into recognition, as though she saw in this worn but unbowed young woman an echo of something she herself had once been, long ago, before age and loss had carved their marks upon her. "You have your mother's locket at your throat," the dowager observed, and when Eleanor's hand flew instinctively to the gold oval that hung against her breast, the old woman smiled a small, sad smile that held within it the weight of years. "Oh yes, I knew your mother. Child, we debuted the same season, Margaret Harding and I, before she became Margaret Whitmore and threw away her prospects on a charming wastrel, and before I became the Duchess of Blackmore and learned that even the highest titles cannot protect us from the cruelties of fate." In the hours that followed, as the grey rain continued its endless assault upon the windows and the fire crackled low in the grate, Eleanor listened as the dowager spoke of the past of Blackmore as it had been, full of light and music and the sound of children's laughter, of Marcus as a boy who had loved to draw, who had spent hours in the gardens sketching flowers and dreaming of beauty, who had wept when his father told him that art was no occupation for a future duke and sent him away to learn the business of war instead. "He came back to me broken," the dowager said, and for the first time her voice trembled, cracking along fault lines of grief too deep to fully hide, "and I have watched him build walls so high and so thick that I fear even I can no longer reach the boy I loved, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers and tell me stories he had invented, the boy who believed the world was good." Eleanor felt something shift within her chest, a loosening of the armor she had built around her own wounded heart, and when she took the dowager's thin, papery hand in her own, she understood that her purpose here might be larger than the mere clearing of a debt that perhaps, in this house of shadows, she had been brought not just to serve but to witness, and perhaps, though she dared not yet hope it, to heal. Weeks passed at Blackmore Hall, measured not in the turning of calendar pages, but in the slow accumulation of grey mornings and greyer afternoons, in the endless percussion of rain against stone that had become so familiar, Eleanor sometimes forgot to hear it, and in this strange suspended time, she found herself becoming a student of the household's hidden rhythms, a collector of small observations that she gathered like shells upon a shore, each one a fragment of a larger mystery she could not yet name. She learned to read the servants' faces, to recognize the particular quality of silence that descended when the Duke's footsteps echoed in a distant corridor, the way maids would press themselves against walls as though hoping to become invisible, the manner in which the butler, Mr. Crane, would school his features into perfect blankness that nonetheless could not quite hide the wariness in his eyes, and she wondered what acts of cruelty had taught this household such thorough, instinctive fear. She discovered rooms that seemed frozen in time, a music room where a grand piano sat beneath a white cloth like a body awaiting burial, its keys untouched for so long that dust had settled into the spaces between them like grey snow. A nursery in the upper floors where painted rocking horses and tin soldiers stood in patient rows, waiting for children who would never come, and always, the locked wing at the end of the east corridor, its door heavy and unyielding, guarding whatever secrets lay behind its ancient oak. Yet for all the household's fear, for all the Duke's grinding voice and hollow eyes, and the scar that twisted his face into something that might have stepped from a Gothic tale, Eleanor began to notice other things, small things, quiet things, moments that did not fit the narrative of monster and master that Blackmore's walls seemed determined to tell. She saw him one morning in the kennels, kneeling beside an elderly hound whose muzzle had gone white with age and whose hips had grown too weak to climb the stairs, and his hands, those large, scarred hands that servants flinched from, moved over the old dog's fur with a gentleness that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. She glimpsed, through the half-open door of his study during one of her passages through the corridor, a book left open upon his desk, not the ledgers and estate documents she might have expected, but a volume of verse, its pages soft and worn with what could only be repeated reading, and the title, visible in the grey afternoon light, was a collection of pastoral poetry, full of meadows and birdsong, and all the gentle things this hard man was supposed to have forgotten. Asterisk. Who was he? Asterisk. She found herself wondering as she sat beside the dowager's fire in the evenings, her needlework forgotten in her lap. Asterisk, before he became this creature of stone and shadow. Asterisk, asterisk. What war could so thoroughly unmake a soul that even his own grandmother speaks of him as though he were already dead? Asterisk. And beneath those questions, another stirred, dangerous and unbidden. Asterisk. Is he truly lost, or merely hiding? And if hiding, might there yet be a way to call him home? Asterisk. The first clash came on a morning when the clouds hung so low and heavy that it seemed the sky itself had descended to press its weight upon Blackmore Hall, and Eleanor was returning from the dowager's chambers when she heard the commotion rising from the servants' corridor below, voices raised in distress, the particular quality of silence that preceded disaster, and then, cutting through it all like a blade through cloth, the Duke's voice in a register she had not yet heard from him, cold and final as a coffin lid closing. She descended the stairs without thinking, drawn by something she could not name, and found herself witness to a scene that made her blood run cold, and then, in the space of a single heartbeat, hot with a fury she had not known she possessed, a young housemaid, barely more than a girl, stood trembling before the Duke, her face white as the apron she clutched in shaking hands, and at her feet lay the shattered remains of what had been a porcelain vase, its painted flowers now scattered across the flagstones like the remnants of a garden destroyed by storm. "You will pack your things and be gone from this house within the hour," the Duke was saying, and his voice held no heat, no anger, only that terrible flatness that Eleanor had come to understand was more frightening than any rage. "I will not tolerate carelessness, and I will not be surrounded by incompetence. You have no place here." The girl was weeping now, silent tears that streaked her cheeks, and Eleanor saw in her face the shadow of poverty waiting beyond these walls, the spectre of hunger and cold, and the particular desperation of a young woman, cast out, without reference or resource, and something within Eleanor's chest, something that had been sleeping since the day she learned of her father's debts and her own fall from grace, rose up like a creature startled from slumber and demanded that she speak. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice emerged steadier than her racing heart would have suggested, cutting across the frozen tableau with a clarity that made even the watching servants flinch. "The fault was an accident, and the punishment you propose is not justice but cruelty. Surely the loss of a vase, however valuable, does not warrant the destruction of a young woman's livelihood and perhaps her very survival." The Duke turned to face her, and for a moment Eleanor saw something flicker in those hollow eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of that terrible cold fury, but she held her ground, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling, her chin lifted in the posture of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. "You forget your place, Miss Whitmore," he said, and each word fell like a stone dropped into deep water. "And you forget your humanity, Your Grace," she replied quietly, and the words hung between them in the heavy air, and she watched something in his face shift, not softening, not yet, but a crack appearing in that mask of stone, a fissure through which something almost like uncertainty briefly showed, and then he turned on his heel and strode away without another word, leaving Eleanor standing among the scattered porcelain flowers, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, while the young housemaid remained unpacked, undismissed, saved by a confrontation whose consequences Eleanor could not yet begin to foresee. The discovery of the locked wing came not through intention but through accident. As so many revelations do, Eleanor had been searching for a particular volume of botanical illustrations that the Dowager had requested, wandering the labyrinthine corridors of Blackmore's upper floors, where the dust lay thick and the light fell thin through windows that seemed to have forgotten the sun, when she found a door left ajar that had always before been sealed, its heavy oak frame standing open just enough to reveal a sliver of shadow beyond, and something curiosity, perhaps, or that same strange compulsion that had driven her to speak in the servant's defense, drew her forward into the forbidden space. The rooms beyond belonged to another era, preserved with a care that bordered on the sacred. A lady's sitting room done in faded rose and cream, its furniture draped in protective cloths, yet somehow still breathing with the presence of whoever had once inhabited it, dried flowers in crystal vases that had long ago surrendered their color to time, a vanity table with silver brushes laid out as though their owner had only just stepped away and might return at any moment to take up her morning toilette. But it was the chamber beyond that stole Eleanor's breath and held it captive, for there, in what must have been a private studio, stood canvases upon easels and canvases stacked against walls, dozens of paintings in various states of completion, and every single one of them was beautiful in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache with recognition. Here was light captured in oil and pigment, morning light streaming through orchard branches, the golden hour falling across meadow grass, the silver luminescence of moonlight on water, and here were faces rendered with such tenderness that they seemed almost to breathe. A woman who must have been his mother, her smile gentle and knowing, a young boy with Marcus's eyes, but unmarked by sorrow, frozen forever in the amber of childhood, landscapes that sang of hope and possibility, and all the bright dreams of youth. Eleanor stood transfixed before a half-finished canvas that showed a garden in spring, its flowers mere suggestions of color, its completion interrupted by something or someone that had never returned to take up the brush, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she was standing in the presence of a soul's confession. The evidence of who Marcus Ashworth had been before war and loss had transformed him into the creature who stalked these halls. He was to have been a painter, not a soldier. The Dowager's voice came softly from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find the old woman being wheeled into the studio by a maid, her faded eyes moving across the canvases with a grief too old for tears. But his father would not hear of it, the heir to Blackmore, dabbling in paints like some common tradesman, and so Marcus went to war as duty demanded. And the war took many things from him, but perhaps the cruelest theft was this. The surgeon saved his hand, you see, but the nerve damage left it unsteady, trembling, unable to hold a brush with the precision his art required. And so the man who dreamed in color has been living ever since in a world of gray, unable to create the beauty that once poured from him as naturally as breathing. Eleanor looked again at the unfinished garden, at the ghost of spring forever waiting to bloom, and felt her understanding of the Duke crack open and reform into something deeper, something that encompassed not just the monster she had confronted but the artist he had been, the dreamer whose dreams had been stolen not once but twice, first by duty, then by war, and she wondered if any wound could be deeper than the loss of one's truest self, the silencing of the voice through which the soul had learned to speak. As autumn deepened into the first whispers of winter, something shifted in the air of Blackmore Hall, subtle as the changing of the leaves, imperceptible to any who did not know to look for it, yet undeniable to those who had lived long enough within these walls to recognize the difference between silence born of fear and silence born of waiting. Eleanor first noticed the change on an afternoon when the light fell grey and soft through the Dowager's windows, and she was reading aloud from a volume of Wordsworth, her voice weaving the poet's words into the quiet room, when she became aware of a presence in the doorway, not the hovering anxiety of a servant, but something larger, something that displaced the very air, and she looked up to find the Duke standing in the shadows of the corridor, his scarred face half hidden in darkness, listening with an expression she could not name but which held none of the coldness she had come to expect. And when their eyes met, he did not immediately withdraw as he once would have, but lingered for a moment that stretched between them like a held breath, before inclining his head almost imperceptibly and moving away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with a rhythm that seemed somehow less urgent, less driven by the demons that usually pursued him. The incidents multiplied in the days that followed, small as scattered seeds yet accumulating into something that might, given time, grow, a morning when Eleanor stood at the window of the breakfast room watching the gardeners struggle against the frost, and the Duke entered and paused beside her, his voice rough with disuse as he observed that the roses would need additional covering if they were to survive the coming cold, a simple statement, requiring no response, yet offered like a gift wrapped in common paper. An evening when she discovered a book left on the table in the library, a collection of botanical illustrations with a slip of paper marking a page of winter hellebores, and though no note accompanied it, she recognized the gesture for what it was, a dinner at which he appeared for the first time in weeks, taking his place at the head of the table while Eleanor sat with the dowager, and though he spoke little, his presence alone seemed to lighten something in the old woman's eyes, and Eleanor caught him watching her across the candles with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in ways she dared not examine too closely. The household noticed, of course servants always notice, their observations traded in whispers and meaningful glances, and Eleanor became aware of the way the cook now prepared dishes she had once mentioned enjoying, the way the housekeeper no longer flinched when footsteps approached, the way the elderly hound had begun sleeping in the corridor outside the dowager's chambers, as though standing guard over something precious, and she understood that hope, like the first green shoots pressing through frozen earth, was beginning to stir in this house that had known only winter for so long, and she found herself afraid to trust it, afraid to believe that the cracks she had witnessed in the Duke's armor might widen into doorways, afraid most of all of the warmth kindling in her own chest times. Do not mistake necessity for affection, asterisk, she warned herself in the quiet hours of the night, asterisk, do not confuse proximity with connection times, and yet she could not deny that something had changed, that the man who had commanded her obedience now seemed to be seeking, in his halting and uncertain way, something else entirely. The cry that tore through the stillness of the night was not human, or rather, it was too human, stripped of all the civilized veneer that separates the waking mind from its deepest terrors, a sound of such raw anguish that Eleanor was on her feet and moving before consciousness fully claimed her, her heart pounding against her ribs as she pulled a shawl over her nightgown and stepped into the corridor, where shadows pooled thick as ink between the guttering wall sconces, and she followed the sounds as one follows a wounded animal through darkness, each cry pulling her forward until she stood before the Duke's chambers, where the door had been left ajar, perhaps by a servant who had fled in fear, perhaps by the thrashing of a man trapped in memories more terrible than any nightmare. And through that gap she saw him, Marcus Ashworth, the feared Duke of Blackmore, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his scarred face contorted in an agony that transcended the physical, his lips forming words that emerged as fragments of command and desperate plea. Fall back, Thomas. No, and the name seemed torn from the very depths of his soul, repeated with a grief so profound that Eleanor felt it pierce her own chest like a blade of ice, and she knew she should withdraw, knew that propriety demanded she summon a servant and retreat to the safety of her own chambers. But something stronger than propriety moved her across the threshold. Compassion, perhaps, or the recognition that she had heard too much to pretend she had heard nothing, and she approached the bed as one approaches a wild creature in pain, her voice emerging soft and steady, despite the trembling of her hands. Your Grace, Marcus, you are safe, you are home, the battle is over, you are at Blackmore. And she repeated these words like an incantation, a spell to draw him back from whatever hell his sleeping mind had cast him into, and gradually, so gradually, that she could not say when the shift occurred, the rigid terror in his body began to ease. His breathing slowed from ragged gasps to something approaching calm, and his eyes opened, dark and lost, and full of a confusion that sharpened into horror. When he recognized her, standing beside his bed in the dim light of the dying fire, and she saw shame flood his features, even as exhaustion held him pinned to the mattress, and she did not speak of what she had heard, or ask questions he could not yet answer, but simply said, "Rest now, the night is quiet, and morning will come." And she remained, until his eyes closed again, until his breathing deepened into genuine sleep, and only then did she slip away like a ghost, returning to the shadows from which it came. In the morning, she found it on the small table outside her door, a single bloom from the greenhouse, a winter camellia of such perfect, impossible white that it seemed to glow against the dark wood. No note, no acknowledgement, no explanation offered, but Eleanor held the flower and understood that the Duke of Blackmore had no words for gratitude, no language for the vulnerability she had witnessed, and so he had spoken in the only tongue left to him, the silent poetry of a gift that said, "Times you saw me at my weakest, and you did not turn away asterisk." And she pressed the bloom between the pages of her book, and carried his unspoken thanks close to her heart. The days that followed wove themselves into a tapestry of small moments, each thread seemingly insignificant, alone yet together, forming a pattern that Eleanor could no longer pretend. She did not see walks through the frost-touched gardens where their breath hung in silver clouds, and Marcus would pause beside bare rose bushes to speak of how his mother had planted them, his voice carrying the weight of memory without the crushing burden it once held. Afternoons in the library where he would appear as if by accident, settling into a chair across from hers with a book he rarely read, his dark eyes drifting more often to her face than to the pages before him. Evenings when the dowager dozed by the fire, and Eleanor would look up from her embroidery to find him standing in the doorway, not entering, not quite leaving, suspended in that threshold space between solitude and connection, as though he were teaching himself, step by careful step, how to exist in the same room as another living soul without armor, without walls, without the terrible readiness for pain that had become his constant companion since the war. And Eleanor watched this transformation with a tenderness she could not name, and a fear she could not silence, for she had begun to understand that the quickening of her pulse when he entered a room was not merely the residue of their early confrontations, that the warmth spreading through her chest when he offered one of his rare, hesitant, almost smiles, was not simply satisfaction at progress made, but something far more dangerous, something that whispered of futures she had no right to imagine, and feelings she had no permission to feel, and she would retreat to her chambers in the quiet hours and press her hand against her mother's locket and remind herself sternly that she was here as a companion to his grandmother. Nothing more, that men like the Duke of Blackmore did not form attachments to women like her, women of fallen circumstances and empty coffers, women whose only dowry was dignity and whose only inheritance was debt. Times do not be foolish. Asterisk. She chastised herself as she watched him cross the garden toward her one morning, the elderly hound limping faithfully at his heels. Asterisk. Do not mistake kindness for courtship. Do not confuse the gratitude of a healing man for the affection of a whole one times. Yet, when he reached her side and offered her his arm with a formality that seemed almost shy, when he began to speak haltingly of a book he thought she might enjoy, when his fingers brushed hers as he pointed toward a bird taking flight from the skeletal branches of an oak, she felt the walls around her own heart tremble as surely as his had trembled, and she understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that somewhere in these weeks of small observations and careful conversations, of clashing wills and quiet truces, of witnessed nightmares and unspoken gratitude, she had begun to fall irrevocably, impossibly, dangerously for the beast of Blackmore Hall. The village of Ashworth Cross lay nestled in a shallow valley, some 3 miles from Blackmore Hall, a cluster of grey stone cottages and modest shops that seemed to huddle together against the bitter winds sweeping down from the northern moors. And it was to this village that Eleanor travelled on a crisp December morning, accompanying the housekeeper Mrs. Hartley on an errand to procure certain medicinal herbs. The dowager's physician had prescribed a journey that should have been unremarkable, a brief respite from the cloistered world of the great house, yet became instead a revelation that would alter the landscape of Eleanor's understanding, as surely as spring alters the face of frozen earth. She had not expected the whispers that followed her through the narrow streets, had not anticipated the way shopkeepers' faces would close like shutters at the mention of Blackmore Hall, had not prepared herself for the naked fear and hostility that rippled through the small crowd gathered near the village. Well, when someone recognized the Blackmore carriage waiting in the square, "That's the beast's household," a woman hissed to her companion, making no effort to lower her voice. "They say he's mad as his father was. Worse even, that he keeps servants locked in cellars when they displease him, that the screams can be heard on moonless nights." And Eleanor felt her spine stiffen as more voices joined the chorus of condemnation, weaving a tapestry of rumor and legend that bore so little resemblance to the man she had come to know that she might have laughed, had the cruelty of it not stolen her breath. Tales of violence and tyranny, of servants beaten and tenants evicted, of a curse that hung over Blackmore like a shroud, and through it all the refrain that the Duke was a monster, a beast in human form, better avoided, better forgotten, better left to rot in his lonely castle of stone, and something within Eleanor, something fierce and protective that she had not known she possessed, rose up like a flame against the wind. And before she could consider the wisdom of her words, she had stepped forward, her voice cutting through the gossip with a clarity that silenced the crowd. "You speak of a man you do not know. Repeat stories you have never verified. Condemn a soul you have never troubled to understand. The Duke of Blackmore is not the monster of your tales, but a man wounded by war and loss, a man who tends to his ailing grandmother with devotion, who shows kindness to those who serve him, who carries burdens of grief you cannot imagine. Shame on you for feasting on rumor when truth starves at your door." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the winter wind, and Eleanor felt the weight of every stare upon her, but heavier still was the gaze she discovered when she turned toward the carriage, for there stood Marcus himself, having ridden into the village on some errand of his own, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an expression she could not decipher. And that evening, when the household had retired and shadows pooled in the corridors of Blackmore Hall, he found her in the library and asked in a voice stripped of all pretense, "Why did you defend me? You who have witnessed my cruelty, who have suffered my commands, who know better than any the darkness I carry." And Eleanor met his gaze without flinching and spoke the truth that had been building in her heart for weeks. "Because I have seen the man behind the monster, the kindness beneath the armor, the painter hiding within the soldier. I defended you because the man they describe does not exist, and the man who does exist deserves better than to be condemned by those too frightened to look beyond the surface of his scars." The dowager's decline came not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual dimming, like a candle guttering in a draught that could no longer be kept at bay, and Eleanor watched with growing dread as the woman who had become her confidant and guide retreated further each day into a twilight realm between waking and sleep, her breath growing shallow, her lucid moments becoming precious islands in a sea of confusion. And it was during one of these crises, when the physician had been summoned and the household held its collective breath, that Eleanor found Marcus in the corridor outside his grandmother's chamber, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, his scarred face contorted with an anguish so raw that she felt her heart crack at the sight of it, and without thinking she went to him, propriety forgotten, and asked softly what burden he carried that made him look as though he were being torn apart from within. And perhaps it was the proximity of death, or the exhaustion of years spent in isolation with his guilt, or simply that Eleanor had become the one person to whom he could no longer bear to lie. But Marcus began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, halting and broken, as though each word were a shard of glass he had to drag up from the depths of his chest. "I had a brother, Thomas, younger by 3 years, bright and brave and everything I was not. He followed me to war because he believed I would keep him safe, believed his older brother could protect him from anything, and I tried. God knows I tried. When the battle turned and our position was overrun, I gave the order for him to fall back to what I thought was safety. I commanded him to retreat while I held the line, but I was wrong. The intelligence was wrong. I sent him directly into an ambush and he died. Eleanor. He died screaming my name while I fought my way through enemy lines to reach him, and when I finally held him, he was already gone. His blood on my hands, his trust betrayed. My order, my command, was the thing that killed him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as funeral shrouds, and Eleanor understood at last the terrible architecture of his suffering, the commands he issued so harshly, the obedience he demanded so ruthlessly, were not the weapons of a tyrant, but the desperate attempts of a man to control a world that had proven so catastrophically beyond his control, to ensure that no order he gave would ever again lead to destruction, even if that meant driving everyone far enough away that they could not be harmed by proximity to his cursed judgment. And she wept for him then, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, not from pity, but from a grief that felt like her own, for the young man who had carried this weight alone for 2 years, who had transformed himself into a monster because he believed himself unworthy of being seen as a man, who had punished himself with isolation and cruelty because the person he truly wished to punish was forever beyond his reach. And she took his trembling hands in hers, those hands that had once created beauty and had since known only war and guilt, and whispered through her tears, "It was not your fault. It was war. It was chaos. It was tragedy beyond any single man's control. Thomas would not want this half-life you've condemned yourself to, would not want his death to become the death of everything you might have been. The days that followed that moment of terrible intimacy in the corridor were marked by a withdrawal so complete, so deliberate, that Eleanor might have believed she had dreamed the entire confession, had she not still felt the ghost of his trembling hands in hers, and she watched with mounting despair as Marcus rebuilt his walls stone by stone, higher and more impenetrable than before, as though the vulnerability he had shown her had been a wound he now sought to cauterize through the familiar fire of coldness and command. He ceased appearing at meals, ceased his tentative visits to the library, where they had begun to share quiet evenings, ceased even his vigils at his grandmother's bedside. And when Eleanor encountered him in the corridors, he looked through her as though she were made of glass, as though she were nothing more than another servant to be overlooked, another piece of furniture in the great empty house he had made his prison, and she understood with a grief that sat heavy in her chest that this was not cruelty born of malice, but cruelty born of terror, that he had shown her the bleeding center of himself, and now could not bear to face her knowing eyes, that shame and fear were driving him to destroy the fragile bridge they had built between their solitudes. And so, when he summoned her to his study, 3 days after his confession, when she entered that dark room where their story had begun and found him standing rigid before the fire with his back to her, she knew before he spoke what words were coming and steeled herself against them like a sailor bracing for a storm that cannot be outrun. "The arrangement is fulfilled," he said, his voice flat and cold as the winter wind that howled beyond the windows. "My grandmother's condition has stabilized sufficiently. Your services are no longer required, and I am releasing you from your obligation. The debts have been paid. You are free to return to whatever life awaits you beyond these walls. My carriage will convey you to the village tomorrow, where you may arrange passage to wherever you wish to go. Consider this prison sentence commuted." Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she thought of the modest inheritance that awaited her, the distant cousins who might grudgingly offer shelter, the grey and lonely future that stretched before her like an unmarked road through winter fields. But more than this, she thought of the man before her, the man who had wept in her arms, who had shared his darkest truth, who now sought to cast her out not because he did not want her presence, but because he wanted it too much, and could not bear the weight of that wanting. And she recognized at last the shape of his strategy. He commanded obedience because he could not risk anyone staying by choice, pushed away before he could be abandoned, imprisoned himself in loneliness because connection had cost him everything he loved, and the words he spoke now, "I release you from this prison," were not a gift of freedom, but a desperate fortification, a final wall erected against the terrifying possibility that someone might choose to remain, might choose him despite everything. And Eleanor stood at the crossroads of her fate, freedom offered, and fear counseling acceptance. Yet something stronger than fear rose within her, something that had been growing since the first moment she had refused to cower before his commands, something that whispered that this man, this wounded and impossible man, was worth fighting for. She did not leave instead. Eleanor stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the heavy silence, like the sound of a decision being sealed, and Marcus turned at last from the fire to face her, his expression shifting from cold command to something raw, something almost like fear. As she crossed the distance between them with steps that did not falter, though her heart beat wild as a caged bird against her ribs, and when she stood before him close enough to see the firelight flickering in his haunted eyes, she spoke with a voice that trembled only slightly, drawing strength from a well she had not known she possessed. "No, I will not accept your dismissal. I will not climb into your carriage and disappear into the grey world beyond these walls. I will not give you the satisfaction of confirming what you so desperately wish to believe about yourself." And his jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides as he demanded to know what she meant by such insolence, such refusal to obey a direct command from the master of this house. And Eleanor felt something break free within her, some final restraint that had held her tongue, and the words poured forth like water through a shattered dam. "You command everyone to obey you, because you cannot bear for anyone to stay by choice. You drive them away with your coldness, your cruelty, your impossible demands, because as long as they flee from your commands, you never have to face the possibility that they might have chosen to leave regardless. never have to risk the devastation of being abandoned by someone who truly knew you. But I do know you, Marcus. I have seen you weep for a brother you could not save, seen you gentle a frightened hound, seen you stand in the shadows listening to poetry as though the words might somehow reach whatever part of you still remembers how to feel. And I am telling you now that I choose to stay, not from obligation, not from the arrangement that brought me here, not from pity or duty or any force external to my own heart, but from recognition of your worth, from the certainty that beneath the beast you have made yourself into, there lives a man worth knowing, worth fighting for, worth— and here her voice finally broke, the words catching in her throat as tears spilled down her cheeks. Worth loving, though you have done everything in your power to make such love impossible. And Marcus stood before her as though struck, the rigid mask of command crumbling from his features to reveal the devastation beneath. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, cracked and hollow as an abandoned house. Why would you want such a broken thing? I am shattered, Eleanor. I am ruins and rubble, and guilt that will never be absolved. I have nothing to offer you but darkness and a name stained with blood and failure. And Eleanor reached up to touch his scarred cheek, her fingers gentle against the evidence of all he had survived, and whispered back with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Because broken things can heal, because the cracks are where the light gets in, because I have been broken too, by loss and poverty and the weight of obligations I never chose. And I have learned that healing does not mean becoming whole again, but learning to live beautifully with our fractures. And I would rather stand in your darkness and search for dawn together than walk alone through all the grey and tepid light the world outside might offer. The silence that followed her words stretched between them like a held breath, like the hush before thunder breaks, and Eleanor watched as something shifted in Marcus's expression, not the crumbling of walls this time, but something deeper, something foundational giving way beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. And then, slowly, with a movement that seemed to cost him everything he had ever believed about himself, the Duke of Blackmore, the feared master of this ancient house, the man who had commanded obedience from servants and soldiers and all who crossed his shadow, lowered himself to his knees before her, and Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as tears blurred her vision, because she understood what this was, understood that this was not the kneeling of a man defeated, but the kneeling of a man surrendering, not to her power over him, but to the terrifying possibility of connection, of trust, of allowing himself to be seen in all his brokenness and believing that he might not be abandoned for it, his head bowed before her. This proud and wounded creature brought low not by force but by the simple revolutionary act of being loved without condition. And when he spoke, his voice was stripped of all command, all coldness, all the armor he had forged in the fires of war and grief and guilt. I do not know how to be what you deserve. I have forgotten the language of gentleness. I have made cruelty my native tongue for so long that kindness feels foreign on my lips. But if you would have patience with me, Eleanor, if you would teach me to be the man I was meant to be before the war, and the death and the endless howling guilt took everything from me, I would spend whatever years remain to me trying to become worthy of the grace you have shown me tonight. And Eleanor sank down before him, her skirts pooling on the cold floor of the study, her hands reaching to cup his face and lift his eyes to meet hers, and she saw there not the beast who had terrorized his household, not the shadow that had stalked these corridors, but only a man wounded and weary, and desperately hoping against hope that redemption might still be possible for someone who had believed himself beyond saving. And she whispered, "You need not become worthy, Marcus. You need only become willing to try, willing to fail, willing to let me stand beside you through the trying and the failing and the slow, difficult work of learning to live again." And he reached up to cover her hands with his own, his touch gentle as she had always known it could be, and for a long moment they knelt together before the dying fire, two broken people choosing each other, not despite their fractures but because of them, and the power that had defined their earliest encounters his commands, her defiance transformed in that moment into something far more precious, a partnership forged not in domination but in mutual surrender, not in obedience but in choice. And outside the winter wind still howled against the ancient stones of Blackmore Hall, but within that dark study something new had kindled, something fragile and brave and burning with the first tentative warmth of hope. The days that followed were tentative, as the first steps of a creature learning to walk again after long confinement, and Eleanor watched with quiet wonder as Marcus began the slow and painful work of emergence, He who had hidden so long in shadow now forcing himself toward light, though every step seemed to cost him dearly, and she understood that healing was not the dramatic transformation of fairy stories, but rather this: small choices made again and again, each one a victory against the weight of habit and grief and self-loathing that had governed him. For so long she saw it in the way he began taking his meals in the dining room rather than alone in his study, in the way he forced himself to meet the eyes of servants who had learned to look away, in the trembling effort it cost him to speak a word of thanks to the cook for a well-prepared dish. Such a small thing that would have meant nothing from another man, but from him was a revolution, and the household watched these changes with the wary hope of people who had been disappointed before, who had learned that storms could return without warning. But day by day, the tension in their shoulders eased, and something almost like warmth began to creep back into the halls of Blackmore. Marcus rode out to visit tenants he had neglected for years, and Eleanor accompanied him on these journeys through the frost-hardened countryside, watching as he awkwardly inquired after families he had ignored, as he listened to grievances he had refused to hear, as he made promises of repairs and assistance that she knew he would keep because she had seen the fierce determination in his eyes, the desperate need to prove not to her, but to himself, that he could be more than the monster. He had made himself old friends who had abandoned hope of reaching him, received letters in his careful hand, apologies that came hard to a man who had armored himself in pride, and some responded with cautious welcome while others remained silent, wounds too deep to heal with words alone, and Marcus accepted both responses with a grace that surprised even himself. Through it all, Eleanor stood beside him, not leading him, but walking with him, her presence a steady anchor when the old darkness threatened to pull him under again. And though there were difficult days, days when he retreated into silence, days when the guilt rose up like a tide and threatened to drown him, he no longer faced those days alone, and that made all the difference. And through the window of her sitting room, the Dowager Duchess watched her grandson's transformation, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her failing body forgotten in the joy of witnessing what she had prayed for through all the long, dark months of his despair. And when Eleanor came to read to her that afternoon, she gripped the young woman's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "You have given him back to us. Child, you have given him back to himself." And Eleanor could not speak past the emotion in her throat, but only pressed that frail hand to her cheek as outside the window the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and white and new, covering the grounds of Blackmore Hall in a blanket of pristine possibility, as though the world itself was offering them a fresh page upon which to write a different story. The Dowager Duchess slipped from the world on a morning of crystalline stillness, when the snow lay thick upon the grounds of Blackmore and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, casting long golden rays through her window as though heaven itself had parted the curtains to welcome her home. Eleanor had been reading to her, a volume of poetry the old woman had loved in her youth, and she had felt the change in the room before she saw it. A settling, a release, like the final note of a song fading into silence. And when she looked up from the page, the Dowager's eyes were fixed, not on her but on the doorway where Marcus stood. And there was such peace in that aged face, such profound and luminous peace, that Eleanor's voice faltered and stopped. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside his grandmother's bed, taking her papery hand in both of his own, and the old woman smiled at him with a tenderness that transcended the weakness of her failing body, and her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, yet it filled the room like a benediction. "My boy, my dear, dear boy, she brought you back to us. Do you understand? She brought you back to yourself, and I can leave now, knowing you will not be alone, knowing you will not waste this second chance you have been given." And Marcus could not speak, could only press his forehead to her hand as his shoulders shook with the grief he had held at bay for so long. Grief not only for her but for his brother, for his mother, for the man he had been, and the years he had lost to darkness. And the Dowager lifted her other hand with trembling effort to rest it upon his bowed head in one final gesture of blessing, before her eyes found Eleanor's across the bed, and she whispered, "Take care of him. Child, he is not as strong as he pretends, but he will learn to be strong in truer ways with you beside him." And Eleanor could only nod through her tears, could only reach out to take the old woman's free hand and hold it as the light in those wise eyes slowly dimmed, and then, with a soft exhale like a sigh of contentment, went out entirely, and in the silence that followed Marcus wept as Eleanor had never heard a man weep, great tearing sobs that seemed to come from some place so deep within him that they had never before found their way to the surface. And she moved around the bed to kneel beside him and gathered him into her arms as he had never allowed anyone to hold him since childhood. And he clung to her as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unmoored, and she held him without words because there were no words for this, only presence, only the steady beating of her heart against his and the warmth of her arms reminding him that grief shared was grief that could be borne. And outside the window the sun continued to shine upon the snow-covered grounds of Blackmore Hall, as though in promise that even after the darkest winters, light would always return. Spring came to Blackmore Hall as though it had been waiting all along just beyond the gates, held back by the winter of grief and the longer winter of Marcus's despair, and now that both had begun to thaw, it rushed in with an almost desperate joy, painting the grounds in shades of green so vivid they seemed almost defiant, filling the air with birdsong that echoed through corridors too long accustomed to silence. And Eleanor stood at the window of what had been the dowager's sitting room, her sitting room now, for the household had quietly made the transition without being asked, watching the gardeners coax the long-neglected flower beds back to life, and she thought of all that had changed since that rain-lashed autumn evening, when she had first arrived at this forbidding place, with nothing but her mother's locket and her quiet dignity, and she pressed her hand to that locket now, as though drawing strength from it, for she knew that Marcus had been strange these past few days, distracted and nervous in a way she had never seen him, disappearing for hours into the locked wing, no, the once locked wing, for he had given her the key weeks ago and asked her to make those rooms her own, his mother's rooms that he had kept as a shrine to grief, but which he now wished to see filled with life again, and she had not yet ventured there, sensing that he was preparing something, and her heart beat with an anticipation she hardly dared name. When the door opened behind her, she turned to find him standing there with something clutched in his unsteady hands, his scarred face pale with an emotion she recognized as fear, and she understood suddenly that the man who had once commanded obedience from all who crossed his path was terrified of this moment, terrified of her answer to a question he had not yet asked, and she loved him so fiercely in that instant that it stole her breath. He crossed the room to stand before her, and his voice when he spoke was rough with the effort of vulnerability. "I have been a tyrant and a coward. I have commanded when I should have asked, and demanded when I should have offered, and I have no right to ask anything of you who have already given me more than I deserved. But Eleanor, I find I cannot imagine my life without you in it, and so I am asking, not commanding, never commanding, only asking if you would consent to be my wife, knowing that I am still learning to be the man you saw hiding beneath the monster, knowing that I will fail sometimes and struggle often, knowing only that I will spend every day of whatever life remains to me trying to be worthy of you." And he opened his hands to reveal not a ring but a key, old and ornate, and he said, "This is the key to Blackmore, to all of it, to me, and I offer it to you freely, with no conditions, and if your answer is no, I will ensure you want for nothing for the rest of your days, but if your answer is yes, then everything I am and everything I have is yours." And Eleanor took the key from his trembling hands, and then took those hands in her own, and said simply, "Yes, Marcus, yes, not because you command it, but because I choose it, because I choose you, because I have seen your darkness and your light, and I want them both." And when he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that spoke of reverence rather than possession, and outside the windows of Blackmore Hall the spring continued its triumphant arrival, and somewhere in the gardens a nightingale began to sing. They were married on a morning in early summer, when the roses of Blackmore had burst into bloom with such profusion that their scent drifted through every open window, and Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to Marcus's mother, altered lovingly by the household staff, who had once trembled at the Duke's approach, and who now wept with joy to see him standing at the altar with such naked hope upon his scarred face, and the chapel that had stood empty for years was filled with villagers who had once whispered of curses and monsters, but who had watched with wondering eyes as the forbidding Duke transformed before them, visiting their sick, remembering their names, becoming not the tyrant they had feared but the lord they had always needed. And when Eleanor walked toward him on an aisle strewn with petals from gardens she had helped restore to life, Marcus looked upon her with an expression that those who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their days an expression of such profound gratitude and such trembling joy that even the oldest among them felt tears upon their weathered cheeks. And months passed, sweet months filled with the small miracles of a life rebuilt, and Blackmore Hall became unrecognizable to those who had known it in its years of shadow, for light streamed through windows that had been shuttered for a decade, and laughter echoed in corridors where servants had once crept in terror, and the piano that had stood shrouded in cloth since before the war now sang beneath Eleanor's fingers each evening, while Marcus sat nearby with sketchbook in hand, for he had begun to draw again, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, his subjects no longer the darkness that had haunted him, but the light he had found. Eleanor, reading by the fire. The old hound stretched contentedly before the hearth, the gardens in their summer glory, and most often Eleanor herself, captured in charcoal and eventually in oils as his steadiness returned. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough to create beauty again. And when autumn came round once more, that season which had first brought Eleanor to Blackmore as a desperate arrangement and nothing more, she stood before the mirror in her sitting room, the room that had been his mother's shrine, and was now filled with fresh flowers and morning light, and pressed her hands to the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew. And Marcus came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her, and resting his chin upon her shoulder as they gazed together at their reflection, and he whispered against her hair, "You have given me everything a second chance at life, a reason to become better than I was, and now this miracle I never dared imagine." And Eleanor leaned back into his embrace and thought of how far they had traveled from that first terrible command in his darkened study, from "You will obey me," to this moment of mutual surrender and shared joy, and she understood that the beast had not merely knelt, but had risen again as something new, something whole, and that she had not conquered him but had loved him back to life. And outside their window Blackmore Hall stood no longer as a monument to grief, but as a testament to the transformative power of patience and the redemptive grace of being truly seen. Years passed, gentle years that accumulated like snowfall upon the grounds of Blackmore Hall, and the estate that had once been spoken of in whispers as a cursed place became known throughout the county as a home of warmth and welcome, and Marcus and Eleanor raised 3 children within its walls, 2 daughters with their mother's quiet strength and a son with his father's artistic eye, and the nursery that had stood empty for a generation rang with laughter and the patter of small feet, and Marcus, who had once commanded obedience from all who crossed his path, now found himself cheerfully commanded by small hands tugging at his coat, demanding stories and piggyback rides and one more chapter before bed, and he gave himself to this new kind of surrender with a joy that still surprised him even after all these years, and Eleanor would watch him from the doorway of the nursery, her heart so full it ached, remembering the shadow creature who had growled, "You will obey me," in a darkened study a lifetime ago, and she would marvel at the distance between that man and this one, who now knelt willingly before his children to kiss, scraped knees and dry tears, and on quiet evenings when the children slept and the old hound's successor dozed before the fire, Marcus would take her hand and lead her through halls, no longer haunted by grief, and they would stand together before the portrait he had painted of his grandmother and of his brother, and of all those he had lost, and the paintings were no longer shrines to sorrow but celebrations of love that endured beyond death, and Blackmore Hall had become at last what it was always meant to be, not a fortress against the world, but a sanctuary within it. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this tale, though perhaps it is not an ending at all but merely a resting place along a longer journey, for the truth this story offers is one that echoes beyond the walls of any single hall, beyond the particulars of any single wounded heart. Learning to heal, we so often mistake walls for strength and surrender for weakness. We armor ourselves against hurt and call it protection, when really it is merely a slower kind of dying, and we demand obedience because we cannot bear the terror of asking for love and being refused. But here is what Eleanor understood and what Marcus learned, that true strength lies not in commanding others to kneel, but in having the courage to kneel ourselves, to say, "Here I am," broken and frightened and hoping, to allow ourselves to be seen in our entirety and trust that we might still be chosen. This is the bravest thing any human heart can do, and it is the only path to the connection we so desperately need. So if you find yourself behind walls of your own making, if you have become a beast to hide the wounds you cannot bear to show, know that somewhere there is patience enough to wait for you, and grace enough to see past the thorns to the garden within. And may you find the courage to let those walls fall, and may you discover that surrender is not defeat, but the beginning of everything worth having. And may you rest now, dear listener, and dream of spring.